Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I want to address the top 6 hand plane questions that I frequently get. They come in on a regular basis, so hey, let's put it all into a video and help you get past some of those problems if you're experiencing them. Stay with me. I'm Rob Cosman, and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help you take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, be sure to subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and don't forget to turn on the notification on your mobile device so you'll know every time we release a new video. Good? All right, back to the bench. So the first one I want to address is the one that we get most frequently, and every time we shoot a video, if somebody sees me setting my plane down like that, they go crazy. I get all these comments. My father would have smacked me, my grandfather would have disowned me, my teacher would have hit me. Well, plain abuse. Let me give you the 2 options, and I'll tell you which one I prefer. You can set it on its side like this if you like. However, you have to be aware that now your blade is right there, and it is exposed should another tool bump into it or you move your plane and you hit something. So that's maybe a slight possibility, but it's there. The other problem that I find is that if you jar that at all when you set it down, it's going to cause your blade to skew slightly to the left or to the right. And one of the most difficult problems people have, particularly that are new to this, is getting that blade parallel to the sole so you're not leaving a heavy track on the right side or on the left side. All right, so you set it down like that. Well, you're setting it on wood, so really you're not going to impact the blade. And typically your blade is out such a small amount it probably isn't even touching. If somebody comes along and pushes this, it may dig into your bench, true. However, why do I prefer this? Well, I like to set it down the way that I use it. I really want to avoid that jarring to the left or to the right. Now, if there's something on my bench, I'll frequently sit it down like that. And that's just watching other people do it, and it makes sense, but I don't go out of my way to try to find something. So you'll see me set my bench down like this. Ultimately, it's your plane. Do whatever you want, and there's arguments for and against both, so you make the decision. It's your plane. Another question I get frequently is when you're planing anything, actually, do you keep the plane engaged or do you lift it up each time and set it back down? Of course, the thought is that by dragging it back, you're somehow dulling the blade. Well, let me tell you what I think. Number 1, I don't want to have to lift this thing up as many times as I'm going to take a pass. Number 2, I don't want that clunk to occur, and sometimes even as being as careful as you can, you end up doing that, and that jars the blade slightly and moves its position. Our sharpening process is so quick that if this were dulling the blade at all, I'd rather spend the 32 seconds getting it resharpened after a very minor amount of dulling, if even such a thing were to occur. I don't believe it. I prefer to stay engaged. It helps with the accuracy of what I'm doing, helps with the rhythm, and it just makes sense. So that's the way I do it. So the next question is all about wax. Does putting wax in the sole of the plane interfere with the finish? Well, first of all, why do I do this? When you're pushing the plane through the wood, there's 2 sources of friction. One is the blade actually cutting in the wood, and the other is the sole of the plane moving over the wood. Well, can't do much about pushing the blade through the wood except to keep the blade nice and sharp. But a little bit of wax in the sole makes it so much easier to slide that plane over. Now, I have never had an issue. However, if I was getting ready to put a finish on this and I wanted one last pass to clean it up, I would not wax right ahead of that pass. So as long as you're not doing it on the last or final pass, I've never had an issue, so I don't think you need to worry about it. By the way, that's the one that we use. It's great because the applicator works extremely well, like a lip balm. Anyway, wax sole, so much easier. So this next one I get asked quite a bit as well. And that is, should I buy new or should I buy an old plane and restore it? And I can answer that rather quickly. if you have lots of experience in sharpening and using a plane and you want to buy a good old one and restore it, go ahead. However, if you're new to this and you really don't know how a plane should perform, you really are unsure about sharpening, then taking on an old plane and trying to bring it back and get it into good working condition is probably not the best use of your time. So let me just go through some of the points that you're going to deal with. The blades were always thin. They measure anywhere from 75 to 90 thousandths in thickness. And if you compare that to what you can typically get with a new plane, now this is a replacement blade, but it's a little bit thicker, but still there's a substantial greater amount of metal. So right away, not only is it going to be easier to sharpen, but you're going to get a better blade today than what you would have had back then. The chip breaker, it's another note. The old style chip breaker had a bump on it, and it was more work to get this to fit to the back of the blade than the newer style, which has a bevel with a slightly undercut on the bottom side. Not that this one doesn't work, but it was a lot more pain than this one. So the main part of the plane, which is the blade and the chip breaker, in both of those counts, you're going to do better off buying new. Now, if you look at the plane body itself, the biggest problem with the old planes is that they're made out of cast iron, which means if they aren't already cracked or broken somewhere, if you drop them off your bench accidentally, there's a good chance that will happen. They weren't necessarily stabilized before they were ground, so they probably are not flat. And that's a pretty big task. Again, if you're new to this and you're having to deal with all of this stuff right out of the get-go, I wouldn't advise it. You can buy a new plane that has the tolerances that you're looking for, and it comes ready to go almost out of the box. The way we sell our planes is they are ready out of the box, sharpening included. But a lot of the premium brands come, you just have to touch up the blade, and the rest of it has already been done for you. As far as the rest of it goes, if it's a decent plane, this is an old Stanley Bedrock, you have a good lateral adjustment, the adjuster knob is good, works well. The newer ones, those pieces are pretty lousy, and they don't work very well, and you've got to go in and sometimes redo them if you're really fussy about how your plane works. Sides being square, that's another issue as well. If you're going to use it in a shooting board, you want the side to be square, so when it sits on there, it actually planes and gives you an accurate 90-degree cut on the end of your board. So, final wrap up on this. If you're brand new and you've never done this before, buy new. If you've got lots of experience and you know what you're doing and you know how to evaluate when the plane is good, then you can buy an old one and restore it and have lots of fun. Now this next topic or question doesn't come up quite as often as it used to. And it has to do with the David Charlesworth ruler trick. And if you're not sure what that is all about, the traditional way of preparing a plane blade, you had to sharpen the bevel, you also had to do the back. If you didn't, your blade could only be as sharp as the lesser of the two surfaces. So we would go through and we would flatten the entire back and polish it. When I say the entire, meaning in the process of getting out here, you'd end up doing the biggest part of this. And the Charlesworth ruler trick was David's idea: put a steel rule on your stone, set your blade on its back, elevated by the thickness of the steel rule on the opposite side, and it would create a slight, what we call a back bevel. That's what the question is about. Is there any disadvantage to doing this, and what are the advantages? Well, if you consider the fact that the change is less than 1 degree, by that I mean when you put your blade in your plane, it's parked at 45 degrees. On this one, it's going to be 45 degrees, but then you've got, let's say it is a 1 degree bevel. So you're actually planing now at 46 degrees instead of 45. Do you really think you're going to be able to tell the difference between planing at 45 and 46 degrees? I say no. So there's no difference in time in terms of performance. The biggest advantage comes from the initial preparation. As you can see on this blade, we've gone in to attempt to try to flatten it. It was so far out of flat. And the amount of work that you would do just to get it flat first, so that you had the same polish across the width of the blade, then you would have to go through and work through the various grits to get rid of the scratches from the previous grit. We go up to 16,000. The amount of work involved in this would be tremendous. Let me just put that off to the side for a second. This one, on the other hand, you don't have to do any initial prep to the back of the blade in terms of whether or not it's cupped or slightly twisted, because you're setting the blade on this piece of, this is actually a piece of shim stock, sitting it like that. You start this on the coarse stone with a brand new blade. Stay within 1/4 of an inch of this edge, because if you come in here, you're altering the angle, so you want to stay within 1/4 of an inch of the edge. I prefer to go forward and back, and you would go through until you end up with a nice polished strip. Now, again, you're starting at about 1,000 grit. You'll get a polished strip that runs corner to corner. It doesn't matter if it's wider on one end or the other, as long as the very leading edge has a level of polish, and there are no longer any of these grinding scratches carrying all the way through. Then you would switch grits, and you would eventually stop at the 16,000. On a typical blade, it's probably a 3 to 5 minute procedure. On a typical blade doing it the traditional way, it's probably more like an 1.5-hour procedure. So, no difference in performance, huge difference in the preparation time, and ongoing, every time you sharpen a blade with a back done the traditional way, you have to be careful when you flip that over to remove the burr that you're not working in a dish stone, because the minute you take away from that nice flat back, now when you set your blade down on here, the actual leading edge is not touching the stone and you're not getting the edge that you think you want. This one, on the other hand, your final step is always to come back to the 16,000 and just spend 3 seconds removing any burr. You're guaranteed to make contact because you're repeating the exact process. So much easier. In fact, we did a video entitled 32 Seconds to Sharpen, and it utilizes this technique. And when you really understand it, I met David Charlesworth in 2002, and it took me a month to digest it. But when I fully comprehended it, I remember thinking, this is the smartest thing I've ever learned about sharpening, and all the credit goes to David Charlesworth, who left us in midway through 2022, but his technique will live for a long time. So if you're looking to freehand sharpen and you want to do it the most economical way in terms of your time and get great results every time, do invest in the Charlesworth ruler trick. Okay, I saved what I would think would be the most important for the last. So planes only work according to how well you've sharpened your blade. And what's really interesting is the sharper the blade, not only do they work better, but they're easier to use. The blade goes through the wood much easier. Your control factor goes up, and you're just able to do things so much nicer than if you're struggling with a dull blade. So then the question is, okay, how do I sharpen the blade? Should I learn to use freehand, or can I stick with a jig? Well, let me adjust the jig. Probably the simplest one is this. And you simply put the blade in there, adjust the angle, lock this, and then on your stone, you move this forward and back until you get a burr, and you walk through the process. The downside to that is you've never really learned how to sharpen. If this thing ever breaks or wears out, you don't know how to sharpen. You've got to go buy a new one and do it again. Not only that, but if you're going to walk through our secondary tertiary bevel, trying to repeat that, there's some jigs that you can make that enable you to do it. But the question I ask is why? You can learn to freehand sharpen. We teach hundreds of people how to do that every year. I'm going to walk you through the advantages of learning to freehand sharpen. We did a video, as I mentioned earlier, 32 seconds to sharp. We'll leave a link below. Go in and watch that. The title is not clickbait. That's exactly how long it takes to sharpen. And I'm frequently asked, well, what if it's really dull? And I said, it takes 32 seconds to sharp. No. What if it's really dull? It takes 32 seconds to sharp. If your process is 32 seconds, why would you ever let your plane get so dull that you're having to have somebody else help you push it in through the wood, and you're having to get the blade out 1/8 of an inch in order for it to even grab something? 32 seconds and you're back to getting that finish that you could literally put a finish on. That's the big advantage to learning to freehand sharpen. It is so quick. So if we come down to this end of the bench, let me go through some of the things that maybe need re-emphasizing. First of all, you notice I don't sharpen at bench height. I sharpen down here. Question is why? Well, if you're learning to sharpen and you're doing it at bench height, There's a couple of disadvantages. Number one, you're pivoting from your wrist, and the closer you are to it, the more difficult it's going to be to hold that angle. In order to cover the entire stone, while you're doing this, you're also having to move your arms out like this, and doing both of those things at the same time is difficult at best. So if we move it down here, the first advantage is once we get in position, we can pivot from our shoulder instead of our wrist. So I get it in position, I lock my wrist and my elbow, and I pivot from the shoulder. And the farther away the pivot point, the easier it is to maintain that angle. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our newsletter has subscriber-only content, monthly discount on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. Okay, let's talk about grip. This is probably the key to learning how to freehand sharpen, is how to hold the blade. And this is like golf or any other sport where your grip needs to be consistent every time you pick up the club, the pistol, or whatever it is you're doing. So every time I grab my blade, I hold the exact same way, and this is how I do it. This may or may not fit your hand, but I'm right-handed. So I hold it like this to start with. My fingers are sitting in the groove. I bring in my left hand, index finger first. That goes into that hole, and that becomes my indexing point. I put my pinky, my ring finger, my middle finger, and I move this one over. So now I have 4 fingers right out on the cutting edge, and their job is to disperse the downward pressure uniformly from corner to corner so that I'm not pushing excessively hard in one spot or the other. The other part of freehand sharpening that folks have a difficult time with is the angles. So let's explain those a little bit further, because this will all make sense if we do. The primary bevel, which is the main bevel on the blade, is typically 25 degrees. The angle that the blade is held in the plane, meaning sitting on the frog, is 45 degrees. If you ever exceed 45 degrees on any of the bevels underneath here, what will happen is the heel will touch the wood before the toe, and your plane won't function. So you have to stay between 25 degrees and 45 in order for this to work. And the way we do it, we start on the coarse stone and we create what we call a secondary bevel. And the purpose of the secondary bevel is to avoid having to polish the entire primary bevel that we don't use. We only use the very edge. So we elevate off the 25 degrees. So you want to be above 25 degrees. You don't want to be at 45 because, again, you go too high and it won't work. The closer you are to that 25 degrees, the more latitude you give yourself for the next stone. So on the first stone, which is my coarse one, typically it's 500, maybe 1,000 grit, I'm going to set it down on that big wide primary bevel, which is the advantage of a thick blade. It gives you a big wide primary. Locate it, find it, meaning the 25, and then come up just 1 or 2 degrees and then park or lock my wrist and my elbow. And I would go through and I would create my secondary bevel, and I determine that when I can feel a little burr of metal that runs corner to corner. At that stage, I'm done with this stone and I can come over to my fine stone. Now I'm going to do the same thing here, except when I find my primary bevel, that's the one I always come back to, if over here I went up this much, well, on this stone, I'm going to come a little bit higher. Again, higher than the previous, but lower than 45. I'll do the same 10 seconds of work on the stone. I dress the 2 corners. That's all in the other video, 32 seconds to sharp. At the end of it, I simply put my steel rule on the side, and like we showed earlier with the Charlesworth ruler trick, flip the blade over on its back, spend 3 seconds removing any burr by staying within 1/4 of an inch of the opposite edge, and you're ready to go. 32 seconds, and you've got an edge that will produce a surface on the board that is better than any grit of sandpaper, and it just makes the process so enjoyable. No dust, no danger, no noise. Hope this helps. Enjoy your playing. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.